Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the APPG on migration. My name is Baroness Stroud, and I'm a Conservative peer. And this morning, or this lunchtime, we're going to be looking at what more can the government do to tackle child poverty. And we're going to have a particular focus on that issue through the lens of no recourse to public funds. And that will be the focus of our discussion today. And I think over the course of the pandemic, many of us have become acutely aware of the role that Nrpf plays in increasing the likelihood of poverty, and particularly poverty for families with children. And as we have become aware of rising cost of living, rising inflation, and all the pressures that there are on families, this is an issue that we really felt we needed to focus on, particularly for migrant families. So that will be our theme for today. We are joined by an amazing panel. We're joined by Stephen Timms, MP, by Marley Morris from the IPPR, from Martin Lennon from the Children's Commission, and Marika Widman from the Children's Society. So we're looking forward to hearing all of their perspectives, and then we will be opening up for Q&A. So if, as they are speaking, you can be thinking about the questions that you would like to ask them, then that would be really helpful. This event is being recorded, as you will have been made aware as you came in to it. So ladies and gentlemen, with no further ado, I'm going to ask Stephen Timms to open up with his introductory remarks, particularly with reference to his work as chair of the Work and Pension Select Committee, which has had an inquiry on children in poverty, focusing on families with Nrpf. So Stephen, huge welcome to you, and over to you for the next few minutes.
Thank you, Philippa, very much indeed. So on no recourse to public funds, a lot of my constituents are on the so-called 10-year track to indefinite leave, and they have to pay every 2.5 years very large amounts of money in order to renew their leave until they've been here for 10 years, and then they can apply for indefinite leave. The amount of money they pay seems enormous to me. I think it's about £2,000 per person, including children. So, you know, I know families with mum, dad, and 5 children who are talking about £14,000 they have to pay every 2.5 years. And they've got no recourse to public funds throughout this 10-year period. They are hard-working, law-abiding families, but when the lockdown hit, their jobs ended. They had no means at all of securing an income. And I raised this with the Prime Minister at the Liaison Committee in May of last year, and his response to me was that, well, people in that situation should have help of one kind or another. And I very much agree with him about that. But unfortunately, for very large numbers, they just didn't. There wasn't any help available at all. One very important step, though, was the decision of the Department for Education to allow children in families with no recourse to public funds to have access to free school meals during the pandemic. And then thanks to the efforts, the campaigning efforts of Marcus Rashford, the benefits of that were extended through the holidays as well. That has been a real lifeline for lots of families. There's a discussion now about whether that concession is going to be made permanent. That's been under review jointly by the Department for Education and the Home Office for well over a year now. As I understand, I think the Department for Education wants to make it permanent, but they haven't been able to reach a decision. It's going to be a very important decision when it comes. You can, of course, apply for and obtain a so-called change of circumstances, which is an exemption from no recourse to public funds, and then start claiming universal credit. It is a hugely complicated and difficult process, and you really can't do it without expert help of some kind. And of course, lots of people who've got no recourse to public funds are completely unaware that this opportunity exists. To begin with, you had to prove you were destitute in order to qualify. Thanks to a court decision last year, you can now qualify if you can prove you're heading for destitution, as well as if you're actually destitute. But most people who've been through that process, 75 or 80% of them, have managed to get exemption. So the opportunity is there. But one of the problems in this whole area is the absence of data. There is no authoritative data about how many people there are in the UK, how many children in families with no recourse to public funds. The one figure we have is from the Migration Observatory at Oxford University, which estimates there are 1.4 million people, including 175,000 children. I've tried to find from the Home Office some figures from them about this. They've blankly refused to answer parliamentary questions, to the extent that I complained to the UK Statistics Authority about it. The UK Statistics Authority upheld my complaint, but the only only information we've managed to extract as a result of that is some figures about how many people are applying for and obtaining change of circumstances. Still, the obvious question, how many people were given leave to remain last year with the no recourse to public funds condition attached? The Home Office simply refuses to answer. As Philippa has said, the Work and Pensions Select Committee is conducting a series of inquiries on the subject of children in poverty. The first stage was about the measurement of poverty, and we recommended there that the Department for Work and Pensions should resume its work on the measure of poverty, which was set out by the Social Metrics Commission, which Philippa chairs. They started doing work on that. They announced that they were working on it. They stopped working on it for the pandemic, understandable reasons. There were so many other things going on, but they've since said they're not planning to resume work on it anytime soon. And that point was repeated by the Secretary of State when she came to the committee yesterday. But the current stage of our inquiry is specifically about children in families with no recourse to public funds. We've heard from organisations working in this area, like the Children's Society. We've taken evidence from local authorities as well. And we've also had a private session of discussions with families, parents affected by no recourse to public funds. So parents and several children living in one room in a shared house, for example, parents who are having to work through the night so they could look after their children during the day, children being taken into care at substantial public cost because their parents can't afford to care for them, and a lot of people just being unaware that it is possible to apply for exemption through the change of conditions process. And one of the Conservative members of the committee after that discussion made the point that what we'd heard had been pretty harrowing, as indeed that it was. We'll be taking evidence in the new year from government ministers in the Home Office, the Department for Education and the DWP. Very unusually, our call for evidence on this inquiry has not produced any written evidence at all from any government department. It's almost as if nobody in government is kind of willing to take responsibility for what's going on at the moment, but they will all be, all three departments will be in front of us, and it'll be very interesting to hear what they have to say. And I hope that as a result of all of that, we will be able to come up with a unanimous cross-party report on what should be done, to be published, I hope, before Easter, but we'll see how we get on. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for your tenacity on this issue and for just keeping on going on it and seeking to flush out all the data. The actual data is going to be a very real issue, as you've just highlighted. So it's a real privilege to bring in our next speaker, who is Marley Morris from the IPPR, who is going to be speaking about the available evidence on the numbers of children with the Nrpf and the impacts of the pandemic on children and the recommendations out of the IPPR report. So Marley, over to you.
Thank you very much, Philippa. I'm just going to talk a bit today about the report we published recently. I'll post it in the chat on Nrpf, and as has been said already, this is a real concern, particularly for children over the course of the pandemic, because we found evidence that there have been quite significant impacts for children and young people because of the Nrpf condition. So as Stephen said, it's very hard to have good, reliable data on how many children, or indeed how many adults are subject to Nrpf in the UK. The best figure, as he mentioned, is from the Migration Observatory, about 176,000 children under 18. And that's based on Home Office data, which basically collates the number of people who have valid leave to remain, which is not indefinite. So they are on a temporary leave to remain, and typically those forms of leave to remain have the Nrpf condition attached. But it's not a perfect figure by any means, and it's highly likely to be an underestimate for a number of reasons. Firstly, because there are likely to be many children who are affected by Nrpf because their parents or family members might be subject to Nrpf, even if they themselves are not. And that's obviously very relevant for being able to access benefits. And so many children will be impacted by Nrpf, even if they technically themselves are citizens or have indefinite leave to remain. It also doesn't factor in children who are undocumented or who have parents who are undocumented. And this is obviously an extremely difficult figure to accurately calculate, but we know again that there are likely to be quite large numbers of children who, because of the status of themselves or their parents, because they don't have any immigration status, they will themselves face restrictions on benefits. So it's likely to be quite a bit higher actually than the 176,000 figure, even if that's the most kind of reliable estimate we have at the moment. As Philippa said, I just wanted to touch a little bit on what the impacts have been for children over the course of the pandemic. I know Marika's going to go into this in more detail later on, but just to touch on a couple of findings from us and also from Citizens Advice in their report published last week. I thought they did a survey of people subject to Nrpf, and I think some quite striking findings from that survey. They found that around 27% of people that they surveyed were parents who shared a household with children. Around 15% of those parents said that their children couldn't keep up with schoolwork because they didn't have access to a computer or the internet during the pandemic. And also around 8% of parents said that they hadn't been able to feed themselves or their household, and a similar percentage had made use of food banks. And so I think this really illustrates the multiple different impacts that Nrpf having on children, obviously directly in terms of poverty and destitution, but also I think as these figures highlight, impact on education, potentially impact on health as well because of not being able to access sufficient good quality food. So I think there are some really significant potential risks here from the emerging data. The other important point to note, and again this links back to Stephen's point about some of the data he's been able to get from the Home Office on people applying to lift the Nrpf condition via this change of conditions application. I think what's quite striking is that during the pandemic, this number shot up, including for people aged under 18. So we found that numbers of children applying to lift the Nrpf condition were around 200 per quarter before the pandemic. Then in the second quarter of 2020, when the first lockdown kicked in, this went up to nearly 1,400. So a massive, dramatic increase because of the pandemic. That number's now fallen down a bit, but it's still over recent quarters, it's steadily gone down. But it's clear that over the pandemic, there's been a real surge in destitution, where and in particular numbers of children applying to lift this condition. Again, this is probably likely to only be part of the story because, as I was saying before, many children actually have recourse to public funds. It's that their parents don't, and so these figures don't capture that aspect of the recent impacts of the pandemic as well. So drawing on this, our recent report, again, I've posted in the chat, so please do take a look if you've got a moment, highlighted some particular recommendations which we thought were could be targeted to support children who are subject to Nrpf or indeed who have parents who are subject to Nrpf. A few of the things that we've highlighted in this report and which we think are particularly important are, firstly, excluding benefits which are specifically intended to support children from the definition of public funds, in particular child benefit being an obvious one. So if this is not defined as a public fund, then it should be eligible for everyone, and that would mean that that children of parents who are subject to Nrpf would benefit from that. Second, and as Stephen said, there has been some changes recently in terms of access to free school meals. That's really positive to see. I think what we've called for is guaranteeing that all children of families with Nrpf are able to access free school meals. Current policy is only partial, and as Stephen said, it's only temporary. So we want to ensure that is something that applies to all families with Nrpf, and that it is done on a permanent basis. Thirdly, we've called for extending the change of conditions policy. At the moment, it only applies to people, as Stephen was saying, on the 10-year route, but we want it to apply to people with all forms of leave to remain in the UK, not just those on the 10-year route on human rights grounds. And finally, I think this is a really important point. At the moment, it's local authorities that are often that last form of support for families and children because of their duties under Section 17 of the Children's Act. And that means that they've done a huge amount of work during the pandemic to support people. But I think what's needed is two things really. First of all, expanding support for local authorities that have particularly high numbers of families with Nrpf, and again that means having a better sense of the data. But I think, as was mentioned in the chat, there is some data from the Nrpf Connect which illustrates the local authorities where there are particular needs for additional support. And then also I think just clearer guidance for local authorities to explain where and how they can provide that support, what the legal scope is to provide support, particularly during the pandemic, where there was a lot of considerable confusion over when and how they could provide support. So I think these things are really important because at the moment the restrictions on Nrpf mean that local authorities are picking up a lot of the slack when it comes to supporting families and children. Thanks very much, Philippa.
Marley, thank you for that. Thank you too for trying to put some data around the nature of the problem, particularly regarding children. 176,000, which you suspect is an underestimate, given it not including undocumented migrants as well. So I think that's just something for us all to bear in mind as we're looking at this challenge. I'm going to next bring in Martin Lennon, who is going to talk to us about what the Children's Commissioner has learned about poverty in England from the big ask that she's been undertaking, and particularly a child's right approach in supporting children and families with no recourse to public funds. So Martin, over to you. If you can keep it to 5 minutes, it'll just give us more time for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Philippa, and I'm going to do my absolute best. There's 4 things I really want to rush through, so I'm going to try and be as quick as I can. One, I want to just say thank you very much for organising this. It's great to be on the panel. It's a really important topic, and it's particularly great to see so many people both on the panel and around who have contributed so much to this. I want to pick up first on the data point, because we mentioned by several people. We have also tried to estimate the size of this cohort over several years through our vulnerability framework. Several people, including Stephen, have rightly challenged us on that. We have come into the same difficulties as everyone else. So I think we should also mention that when we were looking at it through a sense of vulnerability, not all children who are no recourse to public funds are vulnerable, because some of them have very wealthy parents. I mean, there are lots of, highly skilled visas being granted in the City of London and elsewhere, and children are no recourse to public funds and they don't need recourse. We also have children, as Maya was talking about, who are within Section 17 because they are otherwise destitute, and therefore the local authority has to support them. And that number is very small. So the number that we need to be worried about is somewhere between probably 175,000 and the very small number within Section 17. And it's been a cause of frustration to us, like others, that we don't really understand that group in the middle. The free school meals entitlement is absolutely vital. It would have given us an indication of the scale if we knew it was getting picked up properly. The way it's been recorded doesn't allow us to pick out children who are getting FSM for Nrpf reasons compared to others. That's frustrating from a data point of view, but it also makes it very hard to unpick it going forwards, and therefore, as a logistics point of view, we are quite pleased about that design. So that's where we are on data. I wanted to, as I said, talk about what we've learned from the Big Ask, but I also, I think, picking up on the Chair's opening remarks about the impact of the pandemic, wanted to pick up the importance this week of the life of a young boy known publicly as AZ, who died in the 3rd week of the pandemic during lockdown. And the series case review into his death was published yesterday. And I thought it was quite topical to pick up a couple of those things. I mean, I think it's important to point out that destitution and poverty was not the cause of his death, but there was a kind of difficult combination of factors around his family involving poverty, involving alcohol abuse, but also resulting in a kind of discharge of public bodies. I mean, at one point, the serious case review says, father stated that the family was not homeless, but the parents and children were found in a park at 10 p.m. in September. The situation was that they'd been evicted from their accommodation with no recourse to public funds and nowhere to live. The degree of poverty which the families experienced was so apparent that when they arrived at the hospital A&E, staff did their utmost to provide essential food and provisions for them before they left the hospital. This family was able to access some support, and indeed Dad went back into work. But at the beginning of the pandemic, he was laid off because he was working in the building trade and it was casual work, and it stopped. And AZ, the young boy, died 3 weeks later in circumstances which are kind of complex, but remind us that these are the children we need to be seeing and thinking about that safety net. Reading about AZ's life, what really comes out is how precarious his parents' situation was. And, that's the case for many children in Nrpf, and it's the case for children in a wider group. When we looked at poverty as part of our Big Ask survey, we got about 600,000 responses. The results are quite complex. So actually, when you ask children, are you worried about your parents' ability to provide for you, to provide money? About 1 in 10 children are worried. And that's actually quite a low number when we look at it compared to the poverty figures. But then when we look at children who identify themselves as receiving free school meals or were living in areas of very high deprivation, we see that the concerns they raise about a whole section of other issues, particularly their immediate environment, access to safe spaces, etc., are much, much higher for that FSM group. And when we look in the qualitative data, what children tend to express is not so much concerns about themselves, but either concerns about their parents and the impact of poverty on their parents and the stresses and concerns that's raising. And that's quite a big, broad concern raised by children, or about their peers. They're worried about other friends or other children being in poverty. And there's a very altruistic sense that comes out across the report about wanting to see a fairness and support and all children having the opportunities that they do. We created a list of recommendations in response to that, some of which we got at the SR, some which we didn't. So we are pleased to see the Family Support Fund, and I think it's really important to see that focusing on families. We are pleased to see extension of the Holidays Activities Fund, which is really important. We would have liked to see an uplift to the child element of UC. We would have liked to see more on things like breakfast clubs. And we are hoping, it's clear, one of our strong recommendations, that the Nrpf FSM condition will be extended. So I want to try and move back into the child rights element, because for us, both in looking at poverty generally and looking at Nrpf, particularly we're looking at what is the provision for children. Now, generally, the benefit system is not particularly generous to families with children. Children are the group of the population most likely to be in poverty, and that, of course, is a concern to us and why we want to see the child element uplifted. And of course, around Nrpf, those worries are particularly astute. Now, there is a safety net for children, and I think that's what's really important to remember under the Children Act, which Marley picked up. And I think it's very important to talk about the Safety Act and Section 17 of the Children Act now as we're talking about the care review. Because under the care, a child is a child in the UK, any child present in the UK, regardless of their immigration status, is afforded the protections of the Children Act. And Section 17 of the Children Act is very explicit that the local authority should make payments to families when necessary to support the growth and development of the child. Section 17 is also explicit that they should do so by promoting the family staying together. Now, our experience, the Children's Commission's Office run a helpline, is that local authorities are very reluctant to make those payments. And I can understand there is, local authorities are constrained about funding, but they are children in need, and actually often providing finance to families is one of the easiest ways to alleviate those conditions. Now, I mentioned the serious case review in the child at AZ before. Now, one of the issues they were investigating in that serious case review is the issue that Stephen picked up on, is that local authorities sometimes offer to take children into care rather than to support the family. Well, A, that's firstly a lot more expensive, and secondly, A, more expensive, B, contrary to what children and families want, and children do not want to be separated from their parents, but C is directly contrary to what Section 17 says, which is what you have to support the child with their family. So I think we need this backstop is vital, and Marley was talking about some of the other ways we could address an Nrpf, but this is a very, is a child focused, is looking at the child, trying to provide for them and their families. Now, it's not a perfect mechanism, but it's a mechanism that needs to be there, and we think needs to be used more readily by local authorities, and probably a bit more generously. If you look at, I'm not saying local authorities are rolling in money, but actually, if you look at the costs of lots of the interventions they make with families, and they make with particularly children going into care, supporting them under Section 17 can be one of the cheaper ways to do that. Now, there are other things that need to be picked up, and one thing I think has been a frustration with us in the Home Office is the delay in moving to accepting claims. We intervened recently with a local authority who had been supporting a family who had a Zabrano claim to right to remain. Therefore, it should have been quite a straightforward claim, but it had taken the Home Office 8 years to process it. Now, that family was being supported by the local authority for 8 years, when actually they should have been, the mother should have been able to get right to work fairly straightforwardly and come off that support. So there are problems in the system. There are certainly problems around, well, there's quite a lot of problems in the system, but the really important thing for us is that backstop under Section 17 is used more readily, is used more appropriately. I think, absolutely, as I said earlier, so vital that children, my last point, I promise, are afforded free school meals, partly so that schools know. Because actually schools, and this is a really important thing, often see this on the front line and don't really know what how they can support a family. They should know that they can go to the local authority and expect support under Section 17. They should know that the local authority should not share information with the Home Office, and that can be a worry. It's a worry in a lot of the cases we see, but that they should be able to advocate for the children that they know that are in this situation to get support.
Martin, thank you for sharing that with us. I found it moving when you were talking about the concerns of children who are living in poverty, and your insights on Section 17. I'm sure we will come back to as well in our discussion later on. So thank you for that. I'm now going to go to Marika Widman, who will reflect upon those affected by Nrpf and the impact on children and families, and the recommendations from the Children's Society. So Marika, over to you.
Thank you, Philippa, and thank you for inviting us to speak today. It's helpful and it works out well that I'm following after Stephen and Marley and Martin. I'd like to speak to what we see on an everyday basis at the Children's Society. And many of these points will weave in, especially very well with what Martin was talking about, the AZ serious case review, as well as what children were saying in the Big Ask, how they responded. At the Children's Society, we support families with Nrpf through our direct services and have done so for over 10 years. The families we work with are largely those that Stephen referred to, those on the 10-year route, as well as those who are regular migrants. For those who want to do a bit of reading, last year we released the report, A Lifeline for All, spearheaded by my former colleague, Ilona Pinter, which looked specifically at the impacts of Nrpf on families and children and was based upon a review of our case notes and interviews with families that we support. To give a profile of the families that we support, they are overwhelmingly single parent households, which are headed by mothers. Most of these parents are in frontline key worker roles, including delivery drivers, NHS workers, carers, and in food preparation. Their jobs are often insecure and they're often on 0-hour contracts. They are largely from BME backgrounds, from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, yet in most instances, their children are British because they were born here or have been raised here. Yet these children are still subject to no recourse to public funds as a result of their parents' immigration status. And what we also find in our services, there seems to be a kind of disproportionate number of these families have children with additional needs, which can include learning difficulties, autism, ADHD. The children in these families are most definitely impacted by Nrpf in terms of their development and their well-being. As Stephen mentioned, those who are on the 10-year route, not only are they subject to no recourse to public funds, but they also face these exorbitant immigration fees that they have to pay every 2.5 years that run into the thousands of pounds. So in the background, they're having to save for these fees as well as meet the daily needs of their families. So what we see time and time again is families struggling with money, with debt, not able to afford the basic essentials like food, utility bills. We have parents who are skipping meals or having to make those difficult choices of buying food, buying school clothes, buying bus fare. In every single family that we supported almost, they face insecure housing or homelessness. They're in very cramped conditions or they're sofa surfing. And this clearly has an impact on their children who don't have a warm, safe, stable home or enough to eat. I'll also note that many of these children their educational opportunities are blighted. They don't have school uniform or they have to take long journeys because they can't pay for transport. Or we also have heard from parents where they don't send their child into school on a day when the class is going on a school trip because they can't afford that school trip and they don't want to have their children feel like they're missing out on something all their peers are doing or that they're any different from their peers. As I mentioned, many of these parents are single family households or single parent households and they're in kind of insecure jobs. What we saw during the pandemic was a difficulty around childcare options. So often parents don't have any choice but to go to work to be able to afford to pay for their children, their needs. But at the same time, they're leaving children in sometimes insecure situations in kind of shared accommodation, which they probably ideally would not do. We also see in many of these families, Nrpf has an impact on domestic violence. Women are often in a situation with their immigration status where they're subject to domestic violence, and children see this. And picking up on Martin's point, we also see in our risk work that some of our cases where a child has been exploited, they then realize that a factor in that has been the fact that the family is subject to Nrpf, having made that child more vulnerable to exploitation. What we see is that ultimately it has an impact on the emotional well-being of these children. While parents are very hardworking and are trying to shelter their children from the circumstances and their anxieties, they speak more often about the fact that they can see that their children are very aware. Their children are trying to reassure them when they see them stressed about their financial anxieties, or children are scared that they're going to be taken away. I think the best way to kind of sum up how Nrpf affects families is the statements we've had from parents when they do get recourse to public funds through a change of conditions application or otherwise. We had a mother who said she now she and her son can now have proper meals, and her son doesn't have to worry about the bottom of his shoes coming off. Or a mother who said, I can now be there for my son. I can actually be a mother, being able to focus on what you need to do as a mother, rather than being able to, work and get the finances and just being so anxious about money matters. To turn to our recommendations, like many others in the sector, our first recommendation would be to scrap Nrpf policy so children aren't subject to this situation. But at the very least, we would urge the government not to impose Nrpf on families with dependents under the age of 18. And in particular, if a family has made a successful change of condition application and had the condition removed due to their destitution, not to reapply the condition when they have to extend their leave. It just leads to cycles of destitution and stress, which is unnecessary. We also, as Marley and others have said, would call on the government to make that temporary extension of free school meals to children with Nrpf, which was very welcomed, but to make that permanent. As Stephen mentioned, that review has been going on over a year. We don't know what's holding it up, but we would very much urge that that extension to be made permanent, and also to include children who are undocumented. At the end of the day, what is fundamental is that a child should not be disadvantaged or discriminated against because of their immigration status or the status of their parents. Thank you.
Marika, thank you so much for that. I think what's so helpful from what you have contributed is particularly the emphasis on working families as well, which I think is often missed from this conversation. I've always been struck about the fact that, two people could be working for the same company and one is having universal credit kind of top ups and the other not, and yet they're competing in the same jobs. It's a strange one to me. So thank you so much for that. So just by way of a quick recap and a reminder of what we've been covering, Stephen really helpfully highlighted the paucity of data and the exorbitant immigration fees that go together. Marley tried to put a scale on this of 176,000, which was then slightly given a slightly different colour by Martin. But thank you for that, because that's helpful in the dialogue. And Martin, your comments on section 17, and then Marika drawing out the work side of things. I am going to just ask a couple of questions to the panel, which gives you an opportunity to think about the questions that you would like to ask. And then if you raise your hand, we'll try and bring in rapid fire as many questions as we possibly can. But the first question that I wanted to ask the panel was, what impact will the Nationality and Borders Bill have for the NRPF condition and for children living in poverty? I'm happy for any of you to take that one. So what impact do you think the Nationality and Borders Bill will have? Stephen, I see you've unmuted yourself first too. Do you want to jump in on that one?
Well, I was just going to make that, there's a comment in the chat about this. I mean, I think the changes that are going on, including the current bill, are going to significantly increase the number of people in the frame for no recourse to public funds. I mean, clearly Brexit and the fact that European families coming now are in part of the same environment, the same regime as others, just means there's going to be a larger number. So I think that's the main impact.
Yeah. Do any of the other panelists want to comment on that? Marika?
Yes, I think very specifically in the bill, the fact that it says that Group 2 refugees, those who don't come, to put it very kind of summarized, through safe and legal routes, will be subject to NRPF. And those are, we know, going to be very vulnerable persons. So their children are going to be put at significant risk of facing the destitution in the circumstances we've been seeing. So these numbers are going to get significantly bigger and have, stretched local authority resources.
Thanks, Marika. I'm I'm acutely aware that RAMP is the Secretariat for the APPG, and one of the kind of values of RAMP is to try and be solutions focused as well. And so one of the questions that I would like to ask the panel is, where are the opportunities when it comes to reforming NRPF? Where do you feel like the open doors could sit?
Shall I start on this one, Philippa?
Yeah,
I think it's a really good question, and in taking evidence from people working in this area, what they also is scrap it, abolish it, throw the whole thing away, which I don't think is a kind of practical possibility at the moment. I think my view is that that probably, I mean, first of all, let's make the free school meals access permanent. I think that's eminently doable, and I hope that's what the government review will conclude, and I hope it concludes it fairly soon. But I think beyond that, the most promising area for me seems to be the duration of this condition. I mean, I think, if you, for say the first 3 years that you came to the UK, you were subject to no recourse to public funds, I think people would probably feel that was reasonable and doable. It's the huge length of time that it affects people which seems to me to be the real problem, because the family that I talked to the Prime Minister about in May of last year, they came, first of all, in 2003. They were on student visas for a while. They had children who were born in the UK, they're British citizens, and only after 7 or 8 years did they embark on the 10-year route. So they got another 10 years with no recourse to, so, it's a child's entire life that the family is affected by no recourse to public funds. As you say, no top up from universal credit, no child benefit throughout that period, no unemployment support if they lose their jobs. So I wonder whether we could look at, let's put a maximum duration on this, which is 3 years or something, much shorter than the current period.
Thanks, Stephen. And Martin, you were pretty solutions focused in your comments as well. Have you got? Are you aware of where the open door is in government that you feel like you should be pushing on?
It's a very good question, and I think we have to be realistic about the kind of political context we're working in here. It's not an ideal, it's a very sensitive topic in a sense, and with the current climate and the Nationality bill. I think one thing is worth looking at is the increased focus on local discretionary payments that came out during the pandemic and have now been continued. And as I said, actually, the design of the social care system in England in 1989, the Children Act, had that as a central element of the local authority's role to provide that support. Now, that's been replaced by a broader, or it tends to be surpassed by a broader kind of DWP commitment, but actually thinking about what is the local authority, what can they provide on a discretionary basis, and are they funded to do that is really important. So the Family Support Fund is very important, £500 million. We'd like to see that continued. I think the care review needs to look at sort of what are the kind of functions of local authorities and how do they see that role, particularly as a lot of Section 17 has moved on from the legislation in the Act because of guidance around child protection, and these aren't typical child protection cases, but we need to go back to some of the kind of core elements of the Act. But I think that has been an area where the government have been quite willing to look at extending funding. The HAF has got a lot of local discretion, and so I think we need to look at different models of providing welfare support.
Martin, thank you for that. If you can start putting up your hands if you have a question, that would really help me. And Diletta, I may need some help from you in calling out some questions. And priority particularly go to parliamentarians and officials as well to begin with. Sorry, Diletta.
I can see Baroness Ruth Lister putting her hand up.
Excellent. Ruth, I can always rely on you for a good question.
Always a good piece of service, Philippa, and thank you, everybody. It's been a really, really good session. Two kind of questions, thoughts. one relating to the session itself, that I think one of the problems I've raised a number of times in the past has been the kind of separation out of child poverty issues and migration issues. And and I'm really pleased to see someone from CPAG here, that what more can we do to integrate, and Stephen's inquiry in a sense is doing that, that the Nrpf is a child poverty issue. So is there more we can do, and particularly in the voluntary sector, to bring together those issues? But the other, and it goes to your solutions point, I mean, I too would say scrap it, but I know that's not going to happen. And I do wonder, from a child rights perspective, is there an argument for saying, look, well, actually, I mean, more broadly, that children's benefits should simply not, as I think it was, I can't remember now who said it, Marley said, that shouldn't be treated as public funds for this purpose because they are for children, but particularly where the children themselves aren't subject to the rule, even if they would continue to be treated as public funds, all right, it's the parents who have to claim on their behalf, but they are the children's benefits, particularly child benefit. That is for children, and that should not be affected by a rule that is being applied to the children's parents. And I just wonder if we could make more of that in terms of the arguments for incremental change.
Ruth, thank you for that. Martin and Marika, do you want to comment on that, on Ruth's question? Martin.
I mean, look, I think the principle is a very well made one. From a child rights perspective, you never want to be punishing the child in a sense for the status of their parents. But I mean, I think again, it's quite a complicated thing to deliver in reality. But I can very much see the power of the principle there.
Marika, did you want to add anything?
Yes, I would agree that from a children's rights perspective, we should be providing them at least the benefits that are in place for children, to ensure that any child is able to achieve what they can do their development. I think what's difficult with the Nrpf policy, it's that intertwining of the hostile environment policies. So it is the Nrpf, it's a lack of legal aid. It's the fact that you also have these exorbitant immigration fees that face these families on the 10-year route. And I think it's that interplay as well, because you can provide the child benefit, but we know when we did a survey of families, we know that they were spending about £20 a week for a child on their food for school, in which case the child benefit goes some way, obviously, in helping them, but they still have these fees in the background that they're having to save for. And so we need to, in that case, also kind of address those other factors, make sure that the change of condition applications are streamlined and are easier to do, and ensuring those that are destitute can be brought out of that.
Thank you, Marika. We've actually got a question in the chat here. Martin, has HAF given local discretion? It didn't in the summer. Oldham is the most deprived town in the country, but we get the same amount as the more richer boroughs. Are you in a position to answer that question, Martin?
Sorry, in terms of local discretion, I meant in terms of how the programme is set up. I mean, there's not huge local discretion, but as in eligibility, in terms of who gets given the most, I understood there it is slightly, it's based on FSM eligibility, so that Oldham I would have thought would have got more per head than some of the richer boroughs, but I will go back and check that.
Brilliant. Feel free now, anybody on this call, to put up your hand if you would like to ask a question.
Can I just make a point, Philippa?
Yes.
Just picking up Ruth Lister's excellent point. I mean, I think it is quite surprising to a lot of people to find that where children are British citizens, child benefit is not payable in respect of them if their parents have got no recourse to public funds. I think most people assume that, if the children are British, then there will be child benefit, but that isn't the case. And that does seem surprising, I think.
I think there are two. I'm not sure as chair I'm supposed to be particularly commenting on this, but I'm going to jump in anyway. But I think there are two areas here which are of interest. One is precisely that point, Stephen, about nationality and eligibility, and the other one is the equality of the working environment and people doing the same job, but in effect taking home less pay for it. I think people would be really surprised by that if they understood that fully too. So just while I'm waiting for others to put up their hand and to ask questions, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, to what extent will the current economic environment contribute to children living in poverty? And particularly, there are a huge number of job vacancies at this moment in time. And so just holding kind of in tandem the fact that we've come through a huge kind of crisis situation with the pandemic and now the job vacancies in the UK, I'd be interested in the panel's comments on that. Marley, you have you've not jumped in yet, so shall we come to you first on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's quite a complicated picture. I mean, it's quite possible that with the emergence of Omicron that we could have quite a bumpy ride ahead, both health-wise and economically. So I think it's hard to say. I think on obviously the increase in inflation and rising cost of living is a real concern, I think, for families, particularly with families with Nrpf. So I think that's a real risk. When it comes to, I mean, obviously, I think you're right to point out, we've bounced back quite well in terms of employment, and now the issue is more around labour shortages rather than high unemployment numbers. I'm not sure. I mean, I think as has been pointed out, many families with Nrpf are in work. It may just be low paid work, and that's quite common. And obviously it will depend particularly on the visa type of someone with Nrpf. So I think it's important to highlight, and I think Martin mentioned earlier, the circumstances of people with Nrpf are very different depending on the visa type. So there are large numbers of Nrpf people will be students. Large numbers will be working on tier 2 visas, probably in fairly well-paid jobs. There'll be smaller numbers who are on the 10-year route, as Stephen mentioned. And I think there's probably different experiences for those different visa types. And I think it's probably important to note that. And obviously, some of those groups will be much more likely to be in employment than others. If you've got a tier 2 visa, you pretty much have to be in employment. So it'll vary quite considerably. I think just to go back one point to what Stephen said earlier, I think it is important, really important actually, to highlight this point that it's not. I think often people think about Nrpf, they think, oh, it's about people who have arrived in the country recently, who it's the first few years. You've got to kind of pay in a bit before you are able to access benefits. That seems fair. I think the issue is that, as Stephen highlighted, there are actually lots of people who've been in this system for a long period. We found in the paper we published earlier this year, I think around 56,000 people out of the total number of people who were likely to be subject to Nrpf had actually originally applied for a visa from 2010 or earlier. So actually been in the system for a long period, and yet they'd still had limited leave to remain. And I think this is the problem. We've got people who have been here for years and years and years. Quite possibly they've been working and paying and contributing for over a decade, and yet they still haven't got any access to a social safety net. I think that's something really important to highlight.
Thanks, Marley. And we've just got one question here from Ilona Pinter as well. Ilona, do you want to come in?
Thanks. It's actually more of a comment, I think, based on kind of Ruth's point, if I might. I think one of the problems with, I mean, I agree about the difficulty of kind of getting rid of the policy altogether, but I think one of the kind of problems is that it sort of provides an infrastructure which excludes people, so migrants, undocumented, from the social security system. And so the kind of government's position, I think, is that, you know, it applies that equally to everyone, or to most people. But the problem is the policy itself doesn't affect everyone equally. So it affects families with children disproportionately, women facing domestic abuse, those with a disability, and so on. So I think that's the kind of one point to mention. The other point is around solutions. So often the kind of child poverty, you know, measures that come in to tackle child poverty are often linked to social security infrastructure. You know, so it'll be an uplift to UC, or it'll be kind of things that are then passported off of the mainstream support, like free school meals and pupil premium. And so in a way, even though, and there are examples of provision like early years provision, which isn't itself a public fund, but is then therefore not accessible to those affected by Nrpf, like, for example, the 30 years of extended childcare support for 3-4-year-olds, which isn't itself a public fund, but it isn't there for families who are working, who are, you know, who are trying to increase hours. And so I think for that reason, I think it is still important to think about the infrastructure, because I think just making tweaks here and there, or bringing in groups here and there would be also really difficult to implement. And I think that's one of the things that was seen with the free school meals extension. You know, there was huge, I mean, in my own school, there was huge lack of understanding and communication about who was eligible, because firstly, it kept changing, and it was only available to kind of 4 very specific groups who were affected by Nrpf. So I think there's something just about implementation of these policies that needs to be thought about, and actually kind of bigger changes, like, for example, focusing maybe on children or particular benefits would be really useful. And then I think just another point to pick up on from what Martin said, and others have mentioned, which is that, yes, of course, not everybody with Nrpf is living on low income, and that is, and I think sometimes there's the misunderstanding about that, and the government sort of believes that this 1.4 million, everyone would, you know, if Nrpf conditions were lifted, everyone would be able to access universal credit, and that's absolutely not the point, because obviously all of those people wouldn't be eligible for Nrpf, for universal credit. But I think what's really important is that the measures like the change of condition have a very different threshold to provision of benefits like universal credit. So in order to get a change of condition, you have to show that you're at risk of destitution, whereas for universal credit, you have to be on low income and can have some savings, but those are very different. And so in fact, people end up being very, very much worse off when they're affected by these conditions. I'm going to put a couple of links into the chat, which just draw attention to some analysis that's been done by my colleagues at CASE at the LSE, looking at poverty rates among recent migrant families, which are higher for children, particularly from non-EEA backgrounds, and also some analysis by JRF, again, on poverty among foreign-born nationals. Thanks.
Elena, thank you so much for that. That's super helpful, and also that understanding of how much of the other support that's out there is spawned off the actual kind of welfare state, as it were, and that if you don't get one, do you actually get any of the others? I think that's a really important point for us to make. We are out of time though, so I am going to bring this to land. A huge thank you to our panelists. Stephen Timms, thank you to you for everything you do on the Work and Pensions Select Committee and for your contribution today. Martin, thank you again for all that the Children's Commissioner is doing. And Marley, for your work at the IPPR, and Marika at the Children's Society as well. I think we've had some very rich contributions that open our eyes to some of the challenges that are being created by the No Recourse to Public Funds policy. And just also to, before we kind of finish off, to highlight some of the suggestions that you as a panel have made in terms of making the access to free school meals a permanent feature, reviewing the duration of NRPF to perhaps 3 years was Stephen's. The 10 years is like a huge length of time. Focus on local discretionary payment, maybe looking at the issue of nationality when it comes to children born in this country, and to looking at the equality of working circumstances for people as well. And then finally, that last one that Alona made in terms of the linkages to the existing benefit system for other forms of support. So just a huge thank you to everyone, and to RAMP for pulling this together as well, and for all your service to the All Party Parliamentary Group. We're really grateful.